All kinds of interesting things are happening in the news, and we have a couple of special guests today. So I'm definitely looking forward to conversations with both of them. But I'm going to get into some of the news items that are going on, and then we'll bring in our special guest on World Edition and all along those lines. But definitely a couple of interesting things are happening in the world. Definitely, Xi Jinping is expected to visit Moscow in show of support for Putin during that war that he is launching against Ukraine. And of course, the Ukrainian forces are still fighting valiantly against that invasion and all in that space. So that is one of the things that is going on in the world. And Poland is saying that it is going to supply Ukraine with fighter jets. And the French police are clashing with pension protesters after the dark. And definitely protests were erupting in France over Macron's push to raise the retirement age. And apparently TikTok is in the news because there is that particular app is being banned from government devices in the US, EU, UK, Canada, and New Zealand. So the UK is banning TikTok on government devices, as is New Zealand, and like I said, the other countries mentioned as well. And TikTok is facing a US ban if Chinese owners do not sell. So that is some of the things that are going on in the world and all in that kind of way. I do know that there's actually new news about the pandemic, because there is actually some evidence that is linking the pandemic's origin to raccoon dogs at the Wahoo market. So there are some people that saying that it could have been an animal that started that pandemic as well. So definitely we're still dealing with the consequences of the pandemic and all along those lines. And then there was something in the news that I found interesting, and I'll be telling y'all about that in a minute. And then I'm going to bring in Lee Newton Rose, and we're going to bring in a historical person as well. And then we'll bring in the other gentleman that might be talking a little bit about what's going on in the finance world. But Japan and South Korea have held a thaw in ties as leaders resume mutual visits amid missile threats. So definitely missiles are being threatened all throughout the world, and that is definitely something that is going on throughout the world. But definitely a lot of people are concerned about military security and just the nature of safety of the world and all in that space. But Japan and South Korea met for the first time in 12 years. So Kashada and Yoon bonded over sukiyaki, omares, and beer in the area of Ginza. So they are trying to move to men ties, and business leaders are pledging greater economic cooperation. So that is some of the things that we are seeing in the world and all in that space. The thing that I said I was going to mention that I found interesting here in North Carolina, I don't know how it is over there in New York, where Lee Newton Rose is, and we'll find out where some of the other guests are as well. But here in North Carolina, the state legislature is considering requiring that civics be mandatory for the state colleges and the community colleges if you want to graduate. So they have been alarmed by some of the things that have been happening in that space, and how sometimes people don't even know the basic facts of civics. There have been some studies where people did not know what the Gettysburg Address was and a number of other things. And there were even some people that I think when CNN and other people came by and did a survey, thought that Judge Judy was on the Supreme Court. So that is something that was not something that is good knowledge for folks to have in that lane. So definitely that is why the state legislatures, and I think it's a Republican-backed legislation, are looking at making it mandatory that you complete a civics course. And they're going to have the folks that have to understand the Federalist Papers, read Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail, and also understand where the Gettysburg Address took place, among a number of other things. But that is some of the things that are being proposed, and it'll be interesting to see. And apparently, North Carolina also has a financial requirement as well, and a lot of states do. But that is something that they had to do some juggling with the history courses in order to make that happen, and all along those lines. So it'll be interesting to see what my guests have to say. I'm going to bring in one of my regular panelists, and then I'll bring in Bill Federer very shortly as well. But Lee, what are your thoughts? Because when I saw that, I found that quite interesting that folks were considering the fact to make, at least here in the state of North Carolina, and a lot of folks that watch the show know that I'm based in Durham, North Carolina, a mandatory requirement, not just on the high school level, but on the college level. So they were saying that that was something that was needed. And I know that a lot of our fellow analysts and even some of the founders of this network have been pushing for a better understanding of economics, civics, and finances. But I was just wondering, does New York have such kind of requirements for their state colleges, and what your thoughts are in that regards?
I'm not really sure, but I think it's very sad when people who want to become citizens of the country know more civics, know more about our government and how it works than actual graduates of our high schools.
Yeah, and this was actually going to be on our college level. And I think that that poll was actually our college people, which is very much of a shame and all along those lines. But I agree with you that that is a shame. The other thing, and then I'm going to bring out my guest, like I said, or one of the two guests, but the other thing that I found very interesting in that space was that, I don't know what your thoughts are, but the other interesting thing that I was going to bring up yesterday that I didn't get around to is apparently there's some concept going around that the human mind and the human population may be getting closer towards immortality than we thought, and all along those lines, because there's a futurist out there that is saying that by 2030, not that far along, that we might all be able to achieve that status. And part of it is the technology, because they're saying that there might be, hate to tell you this, Lee, but there might be a bunch of nano robots running around in your body that will fix your body as you go along. So that is kind of what the concept was, with it. There would be nano robots that could literally fix the body, regenerate the body, because part of the aging is that our body starts degenerating and all in that space. But they could literally be running around and fix your body. But then some folks wonder how much of you is you if you're also being controlled by a computer. But that is one of the interesting things that I did see in the news that I was going to bring up as well. But what are your thoughts? Are you ready?
And that's interesting from a natural death standpoint. That's interesting how much we can extend lives. But a good portion of people don't die natural deaths. They die accidental or intentional, and that cannot be prevented, obviously.
Yeah, that can be prevented. And like I said, but if their computers are there, then they're also saying that you can download, because I've heard people talking about the download of the mindset, so that if you were to perish in a car accident, maybe some of your memories and thoughts could be downloaded. But like I said, that might be the world of science fiction. But I've heard some folks that are very much in that lane that think that it could be a reality. But we're going to find out some of the other folks' thoughts in that space as well. But I'm going to bring up a man, because and I don't have on any green. I should be ashamed of myself. I would get pinched on any other day if I didn't have on the right amount of green. And I don't see you have on any green either. But we've got a gentleman that actually knows a whole lot about St. Patrick's Day. So I want to bring him up, and then I'm going to bring up my other guest as well. And I'm surprised he doesn't have on any green either. But Bill Federer, definitely, what's going on, and how did you learn about this lovely holiday, St. Patrick's Day, and just share a little bit about your knowledge around this holiday that is going on today as well.
Well, thank you. And I put together a book. It's called St. Patrick, The Real Story of His Amazing Life from Tragedy to Triumph, and also have a DVD series on it. I have a website, AmericanMinute.com. And I also have a little PowerPoint that I could share. I don't know if I need to do anything from my end.
No, all I got to do is just bring it up and everything. So we'll bring it up right now and everything. And definitely, if you'll share a little bit about this PowerPoint and all along those lines, because a lot of people just hear the name St. Patrick's Day and don't know that there was a true legend behind it, just like we were learning around Christmas about the true legend of St. Nicholas and everything. But yeah, if you want to share a little bit about this particular PowerPoint, we would greatly appreciate that as well.
Great. Well, the Chinese, a lot of things start in China. They build the Great Wall of China, and this makes it so the Huns can no longer attack into China. So they turn west, and it starts a domino effect of displaced tribes across Central Asia that begin to spill across the Roman border. So in a sense, Rome's being invaded by illegal immigrants. But these are the Visigoths and Ostrogoths and Franks and Picts and Anglos. And one of the tribes is actually called Vandals. That's where that name came from. You can imagine what they did when they went through town. And so when this happened, Rome had to pull its legions back from the frontiers. And Britain was a Roman colony. And so Britain is now left unprotected. And it's interesting when you study it. First, the Visigoths and these different tribes came across slow, and they learned the Latin language and they assimilated. But then they began to come across the borders faster and faster. And the faster they came, the more they kept their own language and their own identity. And it began to break up the unity of the Roman Empire. And then when word got out that their borders were open, you began to have attacks, terrorist attacks, military invasions. And so that's what can be expected. And so Attila the Hun is sacking cities all across Europe. And you have him headed toward Paris, but Mainz and Worms and Strasbourg and Cologne and Thiers and Metz. And he has an army of 500,000 men. And they're headed toward Paris. And a young woman named Genevieve gets all of Paris to fast and pray. And for some reason, Attila skips sacking Paris. And so Genevieve is considered the patron saint of Paris. And Attila is going to go into Rome, but the Pope talks him out of it. Supposedly there were some angels above the Pope's head that scared Attila away. But all it did was buy Rome 20 years. And 20 years later, the Visigoths did come into Rome and sack it. And so while this was going on, again, the Romans had to pull their legions back from the frontiers. A couple other things. Rome had debased its currency, so it mixed in so much lead with the silver coins that the coins were worthless. So it was fiat money, so to speak. They called it, token money. So they had their version of inflation. They had immensely high taxes. The emperors would keep the people distracted from all the problems with violent entertainment and welfare. So like the whole city of Rome was on welfare. They called it bread in the circus, free bread and these violent entertainments in the Circus Maximus. They had, all kinds of unjust legal systems. They had their military was cut back to dangerous levels. And so Ireland had Druids, and these Druids is where Halloween came from. And Thomas Cahill wrote in his book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, and I quote him in my book. But the Romans, their first encounter with these insane Irish warriors, were shocked and frightened. The howling seemed to be possessed by demons, all the terrors of hell. Halloween came from the Druids. They believed the woods were filled full of spirits that always needed to be appeased. And he says, Druids sacrificed prisoners of war to the war gods, newborns to the harvest god, believing the human head was the seat of the soul. They displayed proudly the heads of their enemies on their palisades and hung them from their belts as ornaments and used them as footballs in victory celebrations and skull tops for drinking bowls. You get the picture, pretty gory. And anyway, so Patrick's kidnapped. He's made a slave over in Ireland for 6 years. And he begins to remember his parents' Christian faith. And so later in life, he writes a book called The Confession of Patrick. And he says, I was about 16 years old. I did not know the true God. I was taken into captivity to Ireland with many thousands of people, deservedly so, because we had turned away from God and did not keep his commandments. He said, after I came to Ireland, every day I had to tend sheep. Many times a day I prayed. The love of God, his fear came over me. My faith was strengthened. I would say in a single day, as many as 100 prayers in the woods and get up before daylight, through snow, through frost, through rain. And then he says, I converted with all my heart to the Lord my God, and he watched over me. And then he said, one night I heard in my sleep a voice saying to me, soon you'll go to your own country. Your ship is ready. And then he took flight and found a boat on the coast where they were putting wolfhounds on it to take to Europe and sell as hunting dogs, and they let him hitch a ride. He makes his way back to Britain, is reunited with what's left of his family. It's pretty uneventful till he turns 40 years old, and then he has another dream. And he said, in the depth of the night, I saw a man named Victoricus coming as if from Ireland with innumerable letters, and he gave one of these, and I read the heading, which ran, The Cry of the Irish. I thought I heard at that moment the voice of those who were beside the wood of Folkleth near the western sea call out, "Please, holy boy, come and walk among us again." Their cry pierced to my very heart. I could read no more, so I awoke. Well, he took that as a call from God to go back to Ireland as a missionary. And so he goes back and he goes right into the den of the Druid chieftain. And this would be like you going into an inner city and going right into the drug dealer's den. I mean, and he presents the gospel to them in their own language, which he had learned years earlier when he had been a slave. And the Druid priests want to kill Patrick, but the chieftain's like, what's the hurry? He's not armed. We don't get visitors that often, right? And so the chieftain gives him a plot of land. He builds his first church. And then there's about 30 chieftains across Northern Ireland. And Patrick's style of evangelism was to confront them and with the gospel, and even with stories of miracles. The Druids tried to kill him. Patrick said, "Daily I expect murder, fraud, or captivity, whatever it may be, but I fear none of these things because the promises of heaven." He says that they tried to enslave him a couple times, 12 dangers, which my life was at stake, numerous plots. God is my witness, who knows all things even before they come to pass, that he used to forewarn me, even with divine message. I came to preach to the people of Ireland the gospel and to suffer insults from unbelievers. I'm prepared to give even my life without hesitation and most gladly for his name, for I wish to spend it there until I die in Ireland. Anyway, so he evangelizes Ireland, starts 300 churches, baptizes 120,000 people. One of the famous stories is the contest at Tara. So you have a hill and a plain and then another hill. And this is not too far from Dublin. It's sort of northwest of Dublin. And the story was that the chieftain of this area would make everyone extinguish their fires on one particular night of the year, and then bring a gift, a goat or something, to the Druid priests, and then they would get coals to relight their fire for the next year. And whoever did not extinguish their fire on this night of the year would be put to death. Well, it happened to be the night before Easter. And Patrick said, "I'm not going to put out the fire." So he goes to the top of the highest hill and builds a bonfire. And the king sees it and says, "If we do not extinguish this flame, it will sweep all over Ireland." And so Mary Cagney wrote in the article, Patrick the Saint in Christianity Today magazine, and I quote in my book, she said, "Predictably, Patrick faced most opposition from the Druids who practiced magic and advised Irish kings. Biographers of the saint are replete with stories of the Druids who wished to kill Holy Patrick. One biographer in the late 600s, Mertu, described Patrick challenging the Druids at the contest at Tara. The custom was whoever lit the fire before the king on that night of the year, Easter's Eve, would be put to death. Patrick lit the Paschal fire before the king on the hill of Slane. The people saw Patrick's fire throughout the plain. The king ordered 27 chariots to go up and seize Patrick. Seeing the impious heathen were about to attack him, Patrick rose and said, 'May God come and scatter his enemies.' It said, by this disaster caused by Patrick's curse in the king's presence, because of the king's order, 7 times 7 men fell, and the king, driven by fear, came on bent knee before the holy man." Sort of reminds you of the Bible story of Elijah praying on a hill, and the king of Israel sends 50 guys to grab him, and Elijah calls fire down and it smites him. Anyway, so that particular chieftain converts, but he does this again and again. One of the stories is a Druid conjured a fog, and it was so thick you couldn't even see before your face. And Patrick's like, "Okay, that's nice. Can you disperse it?" And he couldn't. And so Patrick prays, and a beam of light comes through, disperses the fog, and then it says the Druid fell dead. It's like, okay, pretty interesting stories. Now, there's no way to go back and actually Google check these stories. But one book was written centuries after Patrick. So he dies on March 17th in the year 461 AD. And so in the 1200s, so we're talking 800 years later, you have an Irish monk named Jocelyn, and he writes a book, and it's called The Life and Acts of St. Patrick. And Again, there's no way to verify it, but these are interesting because these are the stories that were orally passed down, and then he wrote them down. But just some of the chapter headings, for example, chapter 68, of his journey and of his manifold miracles. Chapter 69, the sick man cured. Chapter 71, the dead are raised up. The king and the people are converted. Chapter 78, 19 men are raised by St. Patrick from the dead. Chapter 80, King Ichu was raised from death. Chapter 81, a man of gigantic stature is revived from death. Chapter 82, another man who was buried, raised again. Chapter 83, of the boy who was torn in pieces by swine, restored to life. And chapter 178, the soul of a certain sinner is by St. Patrick freed from demons. And anyway, so you get the story of what type of person Patrick was. One of the chieftains laid an ambush in a valley, and all day long, the only thing they saw go by was a deer. Yet the next day, Patrick's on the other side of the valley. So they must have been waiting and saw the deer, but Patrick walked by. And so one of Patrick's prayers is called the Deer's Cry, and it's also called the Breastplate of Patrick. But it's, I bind into myself today the strong name of the Trinity by invocation of the same three in one, one in three. I bind this day to me forever by power of faith, Christ's incarnation, his baptism in the Jordan River, his death on the cross for my salvation, his bursting from the spiced tomb, his riding up the heavenly way, his coming at the day of doom. I bind into myself today. And then he says to guard against Satan's spells and wiles, against false words of heresy, against the knowledge that defiles, against the heart's idolatry, against the wizard's evil craft, against the death wound and the burning, the choking wave, the poison shaft. Protect me, Christ, till thy returning. Christ be with me, Christ within me, Christ behind me, Christ before me, Christ beside me, Christ to win me, Christ to comfort and restore me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ in quiet, Christ in danger, Christ in hearts of all that love me, Christ in mouth of friend and stranger. And then I bind it to myself today, the strong name of the Trinity. And so this prayer dates all the way back to Patrick. And because he's evangelizing Druids that are illiterate, he would use things to convey spiritual ideas. And one of the things was the three-leaf clover that he used to teach the Trinity. Father, Son, the Holy Ghost, three persons, one God. And then I have a couple more things about St. Patrick. And again, these are in a book and in a DVD. But I talk about how he always felt that he was inadequate because he was kidnapped before he finished his his Latin education. And so you think that's the last thing to worry about. But to him, that always bothered him. And so that's sort of encouraging to us, because here we do things and we always feel like, well, maybe I don't know enough. Well, you can still do lots of great things, even if you feel inadequate. So he dies again, March 17th, 461 AD. And then he has these followers, right? These monks, and the Druids would sing. And then once they became Christian, they would have these choirs with 100 men singing at the top of their lungs. And there's stories that maybe a king wouldn't open his castle doors, and you'd have like hundreds of these men singing at the top of their voice, and the gates would open miraculously. And one was a woman named Saint Brigid of Kildare, and she becomes a Christian, and she's very bold. She goes to these Irish chieftain and tell them that they need to give her land to build a church or an abbey or a monastery or a convent, and they give her land. And so dozens and dozens of churches all across Ireland go back to St. Brigid. And then there's another guy named Columba, which means dove, and he's an Irish monk, sneaks into another castle, gets a copy of the Psalms, sneaks it out, spends a year copying it, and then sneaks the original back in. And when word gets out, the king who's had it borrowed wants the copy. And the other king said, no, you got your original. And it starts a war. 3,000 people die. And this Columba guy is so upset that what he thought was good, copying Psalms, turned into these people dying, that he banishes himself to the island of Iona, a little rock outcropping between Ireland and Britain. And he lives off of clams on the beach, and he lives in a stone hut, and he gathers a following of a couple hundred men, and they recite all 150 Psalms every single day by memory. And they become missionaries to the Scots and the Picts. And then another one is Columbanus, and he is a missionary to Europe, and he converts those heathen hordes that had overrun the Roman Empire that started it all off a century earlier, right? The Visigoths and Ostrogoths and Anglos and Saxons. And the Irish way of being a missionary was you would go down to the coast and get in your little dinghy boat and raise a sail. And wherever the wind blew you, that was where the Holy Spirit wanted you to be a missionary.
Yeah, that
And
makes a lot of sense. Hey, Bill, definitely wanted to get into some more of that, but also want to bring in J.R. Lattice and bring in some other conversations as well, and definitely want to share some more around what's going on in the celebration of St. Patrick's and everything, and all along those lines. But I do know that J.R. has got some thoughts, and I was actually thinking as he was talking about how there's a lot of conversation and a lot of shared things that are even going on in this day based on the historical things that were happening that are part of the St. Patrick's Day legacy. And I know that JR has been involved in a number of things involving, and Sasha will be glad to hear this because I'm going to bring Sasha up as well in the space of what's going on in the modern day times with what's happening in the sense of regulations and policies and things along those lines. Because I do know that a lot of times people are going to be wondering what our voters are going to be doing in terms of regulations, because a lot of people are concerned about new stock regulations and how those things might be impacting us. And we do know that the elections are going to come up, and that is an important issue. A lot of people are wondering about deregulation and whether deregulation is going to be something that we're going to be hearing a lot about in that sense. And of course, where a lot of people are concerned about the current state of the economy and how that is going. And of course, people are wondering about that war in Ukraine, and of course the climate change, and what I just mentioned earlier with the US and China, and even some of the other factors that are going on, and how those trends could impact the stock market. Because I know a lot of folks, JR, that are definitely concerned that we might be definitely in the middle of a recession, and some people are thinking that we might even be heading toward a depression. But I was wondering your take on that, and if you can share a little bit about your own background. I was glad to have your folks that represent you get in touch with me and share some of your wisdom as well. So I definitely want to give Sherry a shout out, because I do know that you are involved a lot in the regulation space and all of that. And there are some businesses that we can't talk about, but I do know that you might have some interesting thoughts around crypto. And I did see the picture that he had of Tom Brady, and apparently crypto and Tom Brady are also associated with everything from Ireland to Tom Brady is associated with everything from crypto to Ireland and all in that space. But I was just wondering your thoughts around the state of the economy and what's going on with the economy and what we can expect. And, some people are very excited about crypto. I know Sasha is not a big fan of crypto, but I know that you don't seem like you're a big fan either. But I'd love to hear some of your thoughts around what is going on economically.
Yeah, it's not that I'm not a big fan of crypto. I just think that the industry is still maturing. And until we have a fully regulated space, it's really difficult to predict how the market's going to ultimately look and how it's going to shape up. Because for the longest time, the SEC, which is the primary governing body for securities in the United States, has been using old rules, old laws, in order to apply them to crypto, laws that were adopted as a result of the Great Depression in the 30s. And Congress has tinkered with the idea of creating new laws that apply to cryptocurrency, but hasn't really gotten there yet. And so what you've had is an SEC that is trying to, what I call regulate by enforcement. They are going after bad actors by using very broad principles that were adopted in the 1930s. And as a result of that, not able to really pin down what is permissible and what is not permissible from a securities law standpoint.
No, that makes a lot of sense. One of the things I was curious about, and I'm sure Lee has some questions as well, is a lot of people are very much concerned about the whole nature of how much power corporations have. We do know that lobbyists and corporations are very much influential in the federal government, and some people are wondering whether they're even powerless because of how much powers the corporations have and everything. I actually know that way back when there was the Occupy term, there was a lot of people that even talked about whether corporations are citizens or not citizens and all in that kind of conversation. But I was just wondering your thoughts as to whether people are being kind of overrun by the big corporations, and whether the big corporations are having too much power and too much control, or does the general public still have a say in what's going on as much as we would like them to have?
Yeah, it's really tough to say, because where does a person begin and end, and where does a company begin and end? Ultimately, corporations are made up of people, made up of shareholders, made up of management, and so to say that that it's one or the other, that it's companies or it's individuals, I don't think is a fair dichotomy. But I do think that you can look at it as a spectrum, that people become part of companies and companies become part of people. And so if you look at it as a range, then in some places companies have more power, in some places individuals have more power. Ultimately, companies, while they can lobby, they don't vote. And as a result of that, I think that really the power ultimately remains with the average voter.
That makes a lot of sense. What do you say to those folks that are looking at some of the big private companies and seeing how they are snapping up public ones? I know that that's been going on with things like Reader's Digest and Burger King and some of the other ones, but definitely that is something that I know a lot of folks are concerned about. And of course, there was some organizations, even in the media, that seem like they have too much control. So therefore, they would like them to be busted up, because I know that even in my own field of the radio and everything, because that's historically where I came from, the world of nonprofit radio and all of that, there was a lot of people in the commercial lanes that are looking at things like Clear Channel and Radio One, and they're going like, well, they pretty much run the whole ship. And some people could say the same thing about the bigger television stations as well. And there's a push to break them up and to kind of like have them be a little bit, give the smaller people a little bit more voice and everything. And of course, the internet has helped in that space. But I'm just wondering your thoughts about whether that's something that needs to be happening or not.
My personal opinion is no. I think that the nature of the internet, the nature of the kind of crowdsourced podcasting movement, and the fact that anybody can create their own podcast, and that it's really up to getting user and listener adoption, makes it possible for everyone to. It really democratizes the space. And so I don't think that it's necessary to go breaking up the major broadcasters. I think that what you have is, more so than at any point in my lifetime, a democratized space where people who want to share their opinion or share their content are able to do so, whether it's on a podcast or on YouTube or elsewhere.
Yeah. And the other question I was going to ask you is, I know a lot of people have been concerned about those corporations and the corporations when there is a major disaster, if they're doing enough to actually address that disaster. I think about the train derailment in Palestine. I think about the water in Flint, Michigan. I think about a number of other things that have been going on, even some of the things here in North Carolina. So do you feel that the corporations are being held accountable enough in the climate change part of the world and everything?
Yes and no. I think part of the challenge is that climate change affects everybody, not just the United States, not just other countries, not just individuals in a particular part of a country. So everybody's impacted by it. And at least the US approach to climate change from a regulatory perspective has been primarily around disclosure. So in other words, large companies are required, and increasingly required by the SEC, to say, here's what we're doing, here's what we're not doing, here's what the impact is. And the theory behind that is that if companies disclose what the average person wants to hear, then it will impact their bottom line. And if they don't disclose what the average person wants to hear, then it will impact their bottom line. And so it's ultimately a way of allowing the disclosure to affect free markets, which in turn creates behavior or determines behavior. And I think that that's been the US approach, whereas in other parts of the world, you have just sheer regulation. You can do this, you can't do that. And because those things don't always match up, because you have one approach here and other approaches elsewhere, you have this mishmash of environmental regulations, and nothing ever really gets accomplished, and things continue to deteriorate. So I think there needs to be some form of coordinated effort if we're going to make any progress on that front.
How much of a world economy do you think is at the center of what's going on, because I know a lot of times we hear, like I mentioned earlier, about what's going on in France, and there is a effort to raise the retirement age there. I know there have been efforts to raise the retirement age here. And of course, we do know that unions both in Europe and other places have had their impact on the world. But I just wonder, how much do we need to be concerned about the global economy and all in that space, even with the war in Ukraine, because that we know that that is definitely draining some of the world's resources and all of that in terms of finances. But I was just wondering your take on the global economy.
Yeah, well, I'm an attorney, and if I knew the answer to that one, I'd probably be in a different business. But my take is that we've got a number of problems. A lot of money's been pumped into the economy, both by governments in the United States and elsewhere, and by the Fed. Low interest rates created real free flow of cash that now we're trying to get our arms around, trying to get inflation down. And simultaneously, you've got now banks that are struggling because they bought low interest bonds that are now worth less than they were when they were purchased. So it's really going to be a challenge, I think, to create a soft landing so that we don't have another 2008 type scenario and we come out of this with a relatively mild recession. I think that's the best case scenario, is a relatively mild recession.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, and I'm going to open it up to the other fellows as well, is how much of a concern do you have about us going into a recession and or a depression, and what kind of impact do you think it's going to have on the political landscape? It does look like we're going to have a rematch of last year, unless somebody comes out and surprises us, or maybe DeSantis will do well, but it is a strong possibility that it could be a Trump-Biden rematch, and even DeSantis isn't exactly a spring chicken and everything. So what is your take on the stock market, and what can we expect from the stock market? Because I do know that Sasha, who's over there, does a whole show around modern investment. So I'm sure he'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are as well.
Yeah, I think that the two factors will be interest rates. What does the Fed do? And the one perhaps piece of good news out of the recent banking crisis is that now increasingly banks are predicting that the Fed will hold rates at the next meeting as opposed to raising them another quarter or half point. So it's a function of what does the Fed do in terms of interest rates? What does inflation do? And lastly, do the governments of the world and do other banks have an appetite for supporting banks that may struggle? And I think if everything happens just right, we can have a mild recession. If everything doesn't happen just right, then we may have a worse recession.
Yep. Lee, any thoughts that you got that you want to share and everything?
Mark just deleted himself. Gee, I'm just very concerned that when it comes to profits, we're privatizing the profits and the banks are taking the profits, or whatever institution it is. When it comes to losses, we're nationalizing the losses. The taxpayer is on the hook for the losses. And it seems like the CEOs, the management itself, is not on the hook for anything. So they can make poor decisions. They reap the profits. And then when it comes to the losses, they just walk away with a payday. Am I wrong? Am I the only one that can hear anyone? Bill, can you hear me, Stasha?
I can hear you. No, I think you're right. I think that some of the things I saw is the payback to the president's supporters. So the people in Palestine don't get an immediate bailout, but the irresponsible behavior of these Silicon Valley Bank people that are tied together with a lot of the supporters of this administration, they get bailed out right away. So it definitely gives the impression of the deep state covering for itself.
And supposedly we had this $250,000 limit what's insured. So the little guy supposedly is insured, but now they're just paying everything. So the whole thing's a charade. If you had $1 million, that's covered also, even though they didn't have insurance for that.
No, I wrote a book. It's called Socialism: The Real History from Plato to the Present. And it goes through how in instituting socialism, you would devalue the currency and get people to go to the government and say, help. And the government says, we'll help, we'll just take over everything. And so Lenin got rid of the middle class kulak farmers, Stalin got rid of the middle class. So from a socialist takeover perspective, it's an intentional creating of a scenario where people will say government help, and the government says, okay, since the currency's becoming worthless and we're coming up with trillions of dollars worth of budgets and inflating it so much that other countries want to divest of the dollar, that if they start selling their oil in something other than the petrodollar, then as the inflation skyrockets, the people will say government help, and it'll be a perfect scenario for the government to say, okay, we're just going to guarantee all the banks, all the money, and we're just going to take over the entire banking system and federalize it through the back door. And we're going to start issuing a CBDC, central bank digital currency, so we can track everybody. And we can connect it with an ESG score. And if you're not woke enough, your money won't work. And we can put a timestamp on it. So if you don't spend your money in the right amount of time, it'll evaporate. And we can turn your money off if we consider you politically incorrect.
Or if you don't buy the right product, or you buy the wrong product.
Yeah, so it's like a back door into a socialist takeover. And it's written about quite a bit in the 1930s. But I talk about in my book called Socialism, the Real History from Plato to the Present.
Welcome back, Mark.
Appreciate it, definitely. And glad to be back. Like I said, gotta love technology and what goes on with technology sometimes in that space and everything. But one of the things I had mentioned earlier, and I don't know how much you can talk about it or not talk about it, JR and everything, but what is your thoughts around this whole notion? Because it has definitely been talked about in the sense of what's going on in the world with TikTok, because I know a number of people have been concerned about TikTok and what is the nature of TikTok. And I know that there's talks of a ban here and a ban, like I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the news show, all over the world, particularly in our Western countries. So is that something that we need to be considering, or do they have too much power, particularly being a agency and a social media agency that's from another part of the world, namely a communist country, in terms of their parent company is and everything? But I don't know whether that's something you can talk about or not talk about.
No, I can't, unfortunately, but I defer to the other panelists and what they think about it.
No problem. What's your take on it, Bill?
Well, it's TikTok, yes, but it's also the government. That everything that accesses the internet, a phone, a computer, has an ID, and they collect all information. They know what websites you go to. They know how many seconds you're viewing each web page. And all this data is available. They put it together with your GPS on your phone. They know where you're going, and they run algorithms. And they, in China, with the help of Google and all these other big tech companies, they've come up with their social credit score, and they can determine how loyal you are to the Communist Party. In America, it's called the ESG. And so it's not just, oh, I want to take a loan and check my credit. It's going to be check your credit and your ESG score. And if you're not woke enough, you'll get a higher interest rate, or you won't get approved, or and so it's backdooring the country into being monitored and then ultimately controlled.
Bill, I'm sorry, all you're saying I agree with, and it's true, but that's only part of it. The other part, and I don't know if it might be more dangerous, is they can target you with ads and information to shape your thinking.
Right. Yeah. So they know your fears and your pleasures. They know the positive and the negative, and they will gear that toward what's called a psychological operation. I again studied in the Cold War. You'd have the KGB taking over countries, and you'd have the CIA taking over countries, and it was where they would first get control of the media, and they would begin to portray the current leader as bad, And then when enough of the country had that point of view, they would do a coup or a rigged election and replace the leader with a Soviet puppet. And then the CIA learned how to do that. And the first instance was Iran in 1953, had a leader, Mossadegh, who sided with the Soviet Union, and he nationalized their oil industry. And you think, well, big deal. Well, wait a second. England had no oil. So in 1908, the British formed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company called BP. And so Winston Churchill transitioned the British Navy to oil. And so you had the Britain needing oil. And in 1953, Mossadegh seizes it all. And so Britain appeals to Eisenhower, who approves Operation Ajax. And the CIA operative is Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. He goes over to Tehran. He organizes mobsters and gangsters, and they co-opt the media to blame Mossadegh for all the problems. And when the country believes it all, they do a coup. They put Mossadegh on house arrest and replace him with the Shah. And then the CIA did this again in Guatemala and in Haiti. And so you had the Cold War. You had the KGB and the CIA doing this in these third world countries. And but what we've been seeing is these tactics being now used on our own population. Mm-hmm. And in 1977, Carl Bernstein did an interview with Rolling Stone magazine, and he's the Watergate reporter for the Washington Post. And he called it Operation Mockingbird. And he said how the CIA had hundreds of assets in major media who would write stories and then insert them into the public to try to move the public's perception of foreign policy issues and so forth. And so this is something that's been going on. It took a big step after 9/11 and then with Obama. But you have the government in real time is doing polling. And they can see what stories are trending, what stories are not trending, and who's forwarding it to who's forwarding it to who, and so it's a monitoring of what the psychological views of the country are, and it's a part of this censoring of the alternative voices that are putting out stuff that those that are wanting to push their globalist agenda don't like.
No, you're coming very close to speaking of the Twitter files and what social media has been doing the last number of years.
Yeah. Along those same lines, I was going to get to JR, and I was curious as his thoughts, because I know one of the things that has been talked about is regulation by enforcement. So I know that is something you can't talk about, is how the SEC is currently starving off criminal activity by those who are taking advantage of those no real rules. And we do know that there are even folks that are associated with our network that are involved in hedge funds and a number of other things. But I was just wondering your thoughts around that, and they relate to managing other people's money and what can be done in that space or should be done in that space.
In terms of how we can better regulate?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think that the key is to come out with specific rules, because one of the things that the government struggles with is when the fact pattern, the behavior doesn't fit with the rules. And so when the rules lag behind the behavior or the technology or the real world events, I think that's where the government struggles. And then the problems build and the problems build until a bubble forms. And it could be a crypto bubble, it could be a financing bubble, it could be a mortgage bubble. And eventually it becomes a major problem, sometimes a catastrophic problem. And as a result, the government is playing catch up. So I think that the key is to try and have some foresight, figure out what are the next problems most likely to be, and to try and get ahead of it rather than playing from behind, which is what I think the current economic situation is an example of. The government, at least in part, helped create a problem and is now trying to solve the problem, and in the process creating new problems. So the holistic view of the situation would probably be helpful.
I'm sorry, Mark, for a second, can I just ask JR a question? Something he just said about the government creating a problem. Does the Fed do more damage than good? Do we even need it?
I do think it serves a purpose
What is
because
that?
we saw in 2008 the challenge of pure free markets where there wasn't enough regulation. But I also agree that sometimes the Fed can try to solve one problem and just create a different problem, which is what I think has happened with inflation. Too much money was pumped into the economy, and now the Fed is trying to control the inflation that it helped create. So the challenge is figuring out what is the right balance. Enough regulation to make sure that free enterprise doesn't run amok, but not so much that you solve one problem and create two more, and it's a game of whack-a-mole.
Along those same lines, and I'd love to hear from your thoughts, JR, and definitely I hope Sasha will jump in as well. I know he's got his show on Russia and Ukraine in about 10 or 15 minutes. But a lot of times people get a windfall of cash, whether it's winning the lottery, whether it's being a highly successful football player like Tom Brady, and then they go and invest in money that is sometimes seen as questionable. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are around that, because we know that Tom Brady did lose a whole lot of money when he decided to leap into the crypto space, but he's not the first one to lose money by bad management of his finances that have had that kind of fame and success. So I was just wondering, because that's one of the things that the network is very much about, is fiscal literacy and trying to make sure that people are more fiscally literate and understand finances. So what is some of the advice that you would have given Tom if you were in his space? I know you're a lawyer, but I was just wondering, because we oftentimes hear about these mismanagements of star money, whether it's football players, and we know we're in the middle of March Madness, and some of those players are going to go to the NBA, or whether it's entertainers or a number of other folks in that space.
Yeah, I think whether it's one particular athlete or a celebrity or just somebody who has means and is able to invest it, the importance of diversifying can't be understated. And that's especially true when you're dealing with speculative assets. And historically, speculative assets were primarily things like venture investments. You're investing in a startup hoping that it's going to become the next unicorn. And there's a 90% chance that it won't, a 10% chance or less that it will. And if you hit the 10%, then you're wealthy, and otherwise you've lost all of your money. And I think that approach, that challenge is especially true in the cryptocurrency space, because it's not just speculative in the sense that we don't know what it's going to do, but it's speculative in the sense that we don't even fully understand what the technology is going to be yet. And so anytime you're investing in cryptocurrency, my advice would be make sure you understand the technology, because it's not just a company, it's a code, it's a blockchain. And if you don't know what it does and why it's going to matter, then there's a decent chance that you're making the wrong investment, because you should at least understand it before you put your money in it. Now, the issue with some of the other losses is that in the cryptocurrency space, that is, the issue is that a number of these exchanges are not heavily regulated, or to my earlier point, the regulators are still trying to get their heads around what the regulation should look like for a cryptocurrency exchange, because it doesn't fit in the ordinary bucket of a stock exchange. And until that happens, I think you're going to continue to see volatility in the space. But just because it's regulated doesn't mean that there can be no volatility, as we've seen with banks over the last couple of weeks. So to a certain extent, that's just the nature of the beast. But to a certain extent, as the space matures, it will get better.
Sasha, I don't know if you got any questions, but one of the other things I was curious about is, are we going to see more banks failing and everything? And I don't know if you can speak on that, JR. If Bill's got any thoughts about it, because we've got those, I think it's 3 banks now that are in trouble, but I don't know whether we can expect more to be in trouble.
I would like to mention, actually, Bill, you wrote the book of socialism, and you should be familiar then with definition of Stalin, and which is very popular these days as well. It means so-called sympathizers of Soviet Union, Stalin, Putin now, in the West. They're all called useful idiots. I'm sure you're familiar with that. So unlike useful idiots, in United States financial system, a lot of simple idiots, they're not useful idiots, they're unuseful idiots. And a lot of people like this and outright crooks, They are in charge of a lot of financial institutions. And by the way, I'm not inspired by the Federal Reserve Board raising interest rates. First of all, they started to raise the rates too late. Is it normal? Are they human beings? And just I wouldn't say that they're idiots, but somewhere in
You just
between.
did.
At least some of them are definitely. So they were waiting and waiting and waiting. So finally, it hit them that, oh, there is inflation. People knew about inflation a year before Fed started to do something. And now they keep rising interest rates. The economy of the United States is booming. It's doing fantastically well. Look at the corporation profits. It's just America is doing fantastically. And if it wouldn't be for Fed, it would do even better. But Fed is trying to hurt because of the perceived inflation. Inflation is a normal thing. All in the world, there are sometimes some periods in their economic development that there is inflation. And there is nothing to fear about. Same as deflation. Sometimes
Sasha?
inflation. What can you do about that? It's a cycle. Yes, Lee.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There's inflation 2 or 3%, and there's inflation 10% and above. As you get to higher numbers in double digits, it's not healthy. It's not good for an economy. It's not good for people's savings.
Depends. If you have money in the bank, actually it does wonderful things for you. If you can keep money in the bank and earn 10%, what's wrong with that? It's not going to happen though, but still, if it would be that scenario, you would benefit tremendously. Now, people who don't have any money, what makes a difference for them? Inflation, 3% or 33%? What's the difference? There is no difference at all, except that the products, what they're buying, they're going higher in price or so on. But you know what? In a diversified economy as the United States, the inflation can be cured just by itself, by corporations, by politicians and so on, but don't kill the economy because of the inflation, because from one evil, you're going into another one, which is much worse. If you will start cutting corporate profits, if you will, people will start get really fear of unemployment because corporations will have to fire certain people and they will not hire as many. So that could create much bigger problems than inflation, in my opinion.
Yeah. Definitely get ready to wind down. I think JR had to bounce, but I'll definitely get in touch with him and everything. But definitely some great conversation. Bill, I don't know if you had any final thoughts before we get ready to bounce over to Sasha's show about Russia, China, and Ukraine, just about St. Patrick's Day, since it is today and everything, or just about the world in general, since you are one of our two featured guests, and definitely hope that both you and JR will make a return of visits, because we're trying to definitely get more guests on, as well as our regular panelists and everything. But definitely appreciated both you and JR. But if you have any final thoughts about the St. Patrick's Day, which of course it's a day, and I guess everybody got to go out and find some green on. And I did see that earlier Lee did change his background temporarily into a green background.
Well, other than the time that Patrick lived, the Roman Empire was falling, and Rome had inflated and debased its coinage. And then there was such high inflation that Emperor Diocletian put on wage and price controls, and people couldn't, to try to control the inflation, he tried to keep wage and price controls. But what did that do? That actually caused people to just walk away from their properties, their land, their mortgages, and just go live among the barbarians. And it happened so much that Diocletian made it so that you could never leave your property or your land if there was a mortgage on it. And so this began 1,000 years of the feudal system, where people were tied to their land and they could never get it out because inflation, kept going up. And by the way, that's still the case in rural areas of India. It's called generational indebtedness. People are born into debt, live their lives in debt, they die in debt, they never get free from it. And anyway, Rome finally collapsed, and and then I go through in my book other different empires that collapsed with debt: the Ottoman Empire, France, the Spanish. They had 3 of their armadas sunk and they went bankrupt. They were spending the money as fast as they got it. You had Genghis Khan, his grandson Kublai Khan, invented paper currency in the 1200s. And Marco Polo goes over to China and is amazed you can buy all this stuff with a piece of paper. And it was called the Yuan dynasty, and so the paper was called the yuan. And but Kublai Khan decided to keep printing it and printing it and printing it and printed too much of it that it eventually caused the Yuan dynasty to collapse. And,
Yeah, that makes
I'm
a
sorry,
lot of
Bill,
sense.
was it backed by anything? Like originally we had things called silver certificates where it was really a receipt for something that was deposited. Or is it just fiat money?
Right. Well, Kublai Khan's was fiat, and but then you had the Medicis and their banking houses when the Muslims were invading into Greece. All the Greek wealth fled to Florence, Italy, and the Medicis would have these castle banking houses, and the wealthy people would put their money in there, and that way they wouldn't have to carry their money around. And then when they wanted to do an exchange, they would write a certificate, a letter, and it would just take it out of one person's drawer in the banking house and put it into another person's drawer. But then the Medicis realized that they didn't have to keep all the gold there all the time, and they could begin to lend it out at interest. And they would make interest for their investors, and they would make interest for themselves. And of course, that became fractional banking. But if everybody wanted their money out right away, well, then there wasn't.
You can get around on the bank.
And then you have the Rothschilds in the middle of the 1800s and up through the 19, where Mayor Amschel Rothschild had a banking house and set up his 5 sons to be in the banking houses in Vienna and London and these different areas. And they began to get involved in politics. And so even Columbia Encyclopedia said that wars would be fought or not fought, whether or not the Rothschilds deemed it profitable to lend money. And so you'd have the king of one kingdom wanted to borrow money from the Rothschilds, and the king of another kingdom, and the brothers would talk. Well, what do you think? And so they would make the kingdoms pledge their national assets and their ability to tax as collateral. And so whether they won or lost, the Rothschilds made money. And anyway, so it's a fascinating study of the banking system. And but what we're seeing today, I think, is a manipulation, and the Great Reset, the Klaus Schwab, the idea of wanting to have a global financial collapse so that everybody will be willing to transition to a CBDC, central bank digital currencies.
Seems like our leaders are willingly going along, knowingly.
Yeah, and the media is covering for it. But they need a
Well,
crisis.
I appreciate both of y'all and everything. Getting ready to wrap up this edition of the World Edition. Like I said earlier, Bill, hope that you will appear back, not just on St. Patrick's Day, but on other days as well. Appreciate both your insights as well as JR's as well. But definitely always glad to have amazing guests, and hope that you will make a return appearance at sometime in the near future.
Well, I'd look forward to it. And again, my website
Bill,
is
it's a pleasure meeting you.
Pleasure meeting you. And then if the book on socialism is one that's popular right now.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate
Thank
you.